Okay, so we now get to the kind of fun bit, and this is to outline some of the paradoxes of time travel. So I'm going to introduce the causal loop paradoxes in this video, and in the next one I'm going to introduce the famous, really probably the most famous paradox of all, called the grandfather paradox. But we're going to stick with causal loop paradoxes for this video. So we'll start with a very simple causal loop story, and we tell this time travel story. So what we're going to have is we're going to represent it, and I'm going to continue to draw these on these sorts of eternalist style graphs, you know, where all time is laid out. We'll have a think a bit later in the video whether, if you're a presentist rather than an eternalist, whether there's a special problem about time travel for you if you're a presentist. Did I say that? Presentist rather than eternalist. Because one thought here is, well, if you're a presentist, you can't travel into the past because the past doesn't exist. I mean, it looks as though if you're going to travel somewhere, the place that you travel to must at least be an existent place. And there's a worry that if you're a presentist, well, because the past doesn't exist, it makes time travel even more problematic than on the eternalist picture, where the past does exist, so it is there for you to travel to. We'll come back to that issue. At the moment I'm going to keep representing things in the eternalist fashion. In the end, by the way, I think that it's no more problematic for presentists than it is for eternalists, but we'll come to that. So for the time being, we're representing everything on this eternalist picture. So the first causal loop paradox is going to be a very simple one, and this is one where, suppose we've got somebody then who is born, so we're going to represent the whole of their life. Let's make them born in 1900 to make it nice and simple. And then let's suppose at the age of 20, so in 1920, they have a mysterious appearance. So I'm going to draw the appearance in blue. Here there is in blue. Somebody appears to them who gives them instructions on how to build a time machine. Okay, so they give these instructions, little booklet, and that's given to the person in 1920. And they spend the next 40 years of their life, until they get to 1960, building this time machine based on these instructions. So they've still got the book here. Okay. Let's suppose at this point the guy's grown curly hair. And yeah, so there's the time machine, gets built. TM. And what they do is they use that time machine to go back, and it turns out that indeed, as you probably already guessed, the person who gave them the instructions is indeed their older self, who's travelled back in time, using the time machine to give the instructions to, right, their younger self. So there's the first of our little stories. And okay, so why is this a causal loop? And well, the question to ask here is, where do the instructions to build the time machine come from? Who wrote them? And it looks as though nobody wrote them. It looks like they've just appeared out of nowhere. It's like, well, okay, this guy, the guy in 1920, gets the instructions, which he then keeps with him, builds the time machine, goes back in time, and gives the instructions to himself. So, you know, this book has kind of appeared from nowhere. What causes this person to be able to build the time machine and go back in time? Well, it's that somebody was able to go back in time and give the instructions, namely himself, give him the instructions to build it. So you've got this kind of causal loop. What causes this person to come back in time from here? Well, it's the building of a time machine by this person here, the same person. What causes this person to be able to make the time machine? Well, it's that the person went back in time and gave him the instructions. I mean, it's actually inessential in this example that we have the same person going back in time. In fact, this could be a different person, so long as, you know, it's built on the basis of these instructions. So there we go. There's a first very simple one. and the idea is meant to be this represents something like an impossible situation. You know, we've got a causal loop here. Causal loops are thought to be impossible. So if causal loops are impossible, this can't happen, then it's not a consistent story. It's a logically incoherent story. So that's a very simple causal loop paradox. There's another one in the literature which I'll just draw, which is kind of, it's quite nice. It's a slightly different setup. It's given by Robin Lepedevin. So it's in the textbook, and it's the case, so it's on page 182 of the textbook, and it's the case of Peter and Jane. So let's try and sketch it out and see if we can draw it. So again, we're going to have a timeline. And in the story, Peter and Jane in 1999 are 20. So let's just put 1999 in here. And let's have, let's call this young Peter, drawn with a big head. Young Peter, YP, and young Jane, okay. So they're out for a walk in 1999 at the age of 20, when all of a sudden a person steps out and tells Jane that she must, let's just draw it in. Somebody steps out, so I'll draw the appearing person in blue again so that we can keep track of this. So this appears in 1999. Okay. And this is old Peter, who's got a diary and gives it to young Jane, okay, who then travels forward in time to 2019 in this story, where, so young Jane is now here. Let's draw young Jane in blue. Oops. So this is young Jane again. Is this going to be the best way of representing it? So I'll try and draw the arrows. So young Jane has travelled to there. And here is old Peter in 2019. Old Peter. And Jane gives old Peter the diary. And then old Peter travels back in time and gives the diary to young Jane. Okay, so that's the setup. I hope you can see what's going on here. So just to sort of describe it once more, there's another extra bit to add to this story to make it problematic. So young Jane travels forward in time. Young Jane gets given a diary by old Peter, travels forward in time 20 years, gives the diary to old Peter, tells old Peter to travel back in time and give the diary to Jane. Okay, young Jane. So that's what's going on. The extra bit is that what they have to do, they have to record their journey in the book, in the diary. So, alright, let's just first of all draw our little diary up here. Okay, this is the diary drawn up in big. There it is. And let's imagine then that when old Peter gives young Jane the book, and young Jane is told to record after she's made the trip that she has made the trip, okay, and she tells old Peter to do the same thing. So let's for the time being imagine that it's empty. So young Jane travels to 2019 and she might record in her trip, note made, a time travel trip. Okay, from 1999 to 2019. So Jane makes that entry in the diary, okay? Gives it to Peter. Oh, that's signed Jane. And then old Peter goes back in time, and old Peter makes a note. made a time travel trip from 2019 to 1999, made by Peter. And then Peter hands the diary to young Jane. But now we've got a difficulty, because we just said, well, let's imagine when old Peter gives the diary to young Jane that it's empty. But we've now seen, I mean, we're now back at our original starting point, and the diary is an entry. It isn't empty, it's got 2 entries in it. So then what happens? Well, if young Jane travels forward, she'll have to make, turn the page and make a new note, made a time travel. And then it's going to have 3 entries in it. And then old Peter goes back in time, he makes an entry. So there'll be 4 entries in it. But then when he gives it to young Jane, it's not going to be empty, and it's not going to have 2 entries in it, it's going to have 4 entries. But then when Jane makes the trip, she's going to add an entry, and Peter will add one. So in fact it's got 6 entries. Right? The point is, with this story, if we ask the question, how many entries does the diary in fact have, there looks like there's going to be no consistent answer we can give to that. If we say that it's empty, then we're going to have to say there are 2 entries in it once we've been round the loop once. Then we're going to say there's 2 entries in it when we've been, 4 entries, we're around the loop twice, 6 entries. If we suppose there's 1 entry in it, then we have to say there's 3. If we suppose there's 2, you're always going to add, by the time you've travelled around this loop once, it adds 2 entries to the diary. But, of course, I mean, when we say travelling around this loop once, it's not like Jane and Peter do in fact make more than 1 trip. It's not like when old Peter comes back and gives it to Jane, Jane makes a 2nd trip. There's only 1 trip. It's the trip where she goes forward in time, just the once, and old Peter goes backwards in time, just the once. There's no sense in which young Jane makes multiple. So, there's something funny going on, basically. And that's dramatised by this diary. The question to ask in this situation, so think about it, reflect upon it, and the question is, how many entries are in the diary? And can you make sense of it, of there being that many entries in the diary, given this setup? So I'll just delete the diary entry, and we'll leave it at that. So, yeah, it's meant to be a causal loop, because, the diary entry there is causation, writing stuff down in it, and how do the entries get to be there? Well, anyway, we'll come back to this. I'll leave it at that for now. So, useful for you to have a think about it and to puzzle about it. And there's the causal loop argument. Now, actually, this is worth saying one other quick thing. The form of argument here is going to be something like this. So it's going to say, premise 1, if time travel is possible, then causal loops are possible, right? Because these stories, we're just telling a time travel story, and it looks like there's going to be causal loops. Oops, then causal, oh dear, what's happened there? Causal loops are possible. Very simple line of argument. Causal loops are impossible, so time travel is not possible. Now, there is a slight... Oh, time travel is not possible. Yeah. There is a slight kind of lacuna in this argument, which is, well, we haven't shown, we've described 2 stories where there are these kind of causal loops involved, but we haven't thereby shown that every instance of time travel involves causal loops, right? So maybe there are some time travel stories where causal loops don't occur. And if so, then it may be that that kind of time travel is still possible. We haven't even if causal loops are logically impossible, we haven't demonstrated that causal loops always occur when time travel occurs. We've only demonstrated that they occur in these particular cases. So maybe this conclusion is too strong here. Maybe the idea is that, or maybe the only conclusion that's really warranted is something like, you know, if time travel is, or how can we put it, sometimes time travel stories result in causal loops. Causal loops are impossible, so those particular time travel stories are not possible, right? Maybe it doesn't show that time travel in general isn't possible. I hope that makes sense. But yes, it's worth noting in that regard that it might also be true, and I'm not sure how to argue for this, I've never really seen a convincing argument, but it might always be true that when we have an instance of time travel, we've got a causal loop going on. And I do think there is some plausibility to that, and maybe I'll talk about that when I come to the kind of solution to this. Maybe it is the case that even though those stories that we just gave kind of make it dramatic that there's a causal loop involved, maybe any backwards time travel is going to involve a causal loop. But I'll leave you again to think about that one and see what you think. And alright, so there are causal loop paradoxes. The next video then we're going to talk about the famous grandfather. We're going to set up the famous grandfather paradox.